Hello, everyone. Welcome to Fluently. Speak English fluently. I'm so glad you're here today, ready to take another step toward mastering English. If you're new to the channel, don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell so you don't miss out on any of our tips and lessons. Today, we're going to talk about something that holds back so many people from speaking English fluently. Don't overthink, just speak. It's a common challenge I see with my students. One day, one of my students, Aaron, approached me with a troubled look on his face. He said, "Teacher, how do I stop overthinking when I try to speak English? I know what I want to say, but I freeze up or I hesitate because I'm worried about making mistakes." And I shared with him a little secret I've learned over the years of teaching English. The best way to learn English is not by thinking about it too much, but by just speaking and practicing. Now, you might be wondering, but what about grammar? What about perfect pronunciation? Yes, these things are important, but I believe there is a time and place for focusing on them. When you're trying to communicate, fluency is the goal. And fluency comes from confidence, not perfection. One of my students, Priya, was particularly focused on speaking perfectly, trying to sound exactly like native speakers. She spent hours studying pronunciation and intonation, but still, whenever she had to speak in front of others, she would freeze. She would worry about getting every word right, and as a result, she often didn't speak at all. I told her, "Priya, don't worry about sounding perfect. Fluency doesn't come from perfection. It comes from using English as much as possible. Don't overthink it. Just speak." This is where we need to change the mindset. The goal isn't to impress anyone with perfect grammar or pronunciation. It's about conveying meaning and building a connection. Let's talk about one of my newer students, Samir, who was terrified of speaking with native speakers. He had been learning English for years, but whenever he had the chance to converse with a native speaker, he'd freeze. Samir was constantly worrying about making mistakes, so he would avoid speaking altogether, and his fluency didn't improve. One day I told him, "Samir, your mistakes don't define you. They help you grow. If you focus on not making mistakes, you're already holding yourself back from speaking." I encouraged him to focus less on what he might say wrong and more on just getting his message across. I shared the example of a situation I once faced in Japan. I didn't speak the language fluently at first, but I made the effort to talk to people. Some of my sentences were incorrect, but they understood me, and I understood them. That was enough, and that's what matters when you speak any language. We started practicing speaking together. I would say something, and he would try to respond in English, without thinking too much about whether he was saying it correctly. Slowly but surely, Samir gained confidence. 1 month later, he told me, "Teacher, I had a conversation with a native English speaker today, and I didn't overthink it. I just spoke." He was thrilled, and so was I. Let's take a moment to think about how we can help ourselves when we freeze up. One thing I always tell my students is to pause and take a deep breath before speaking. That moment of stillness helps clear the mind and prevents the brain from running wild with overthinking. In fact, this technique has worked wonders for students like Leela, who used to panic before speaking. Leela had been an advanced student for a long time, but every time she had to speak in front of a group, she would get nervous. "I always think I'm going to make mistakes," she told me. "I freeze and nothing comes out." I suggested she take a moment to pause and breathe. Inhale for 4 seconds, hold it for 4 seconds, and exhale for 4 seconds. This technique calms the nerves and gives you a moment to gather your thoughts. At first, Leela was skeptical, but after trying it a few times, she started to feel the difference. She no longer panicked before speaking. She took a breath and simply spoke. The more she practiced, the more natural it became. Now, Leela often volunteers to speak during class discussions, and she no longer worries about being perfect. Another student of mine, Arif, was constantly worried about sounding stilted or unnatural when he spoke English. He didn't like how he sounded when he used simple words. Arif thought he had to speak like a news anchor to be taken seriously, but I explained to him that natural communication doesn't always require complex vocabulary. Sometimes simplicity is the key. I gave him an example. When I speak to my friends in English, I don't always use complicated words. I keep it simple so I can express myself easily. That's how you sound natural, by focusing on meaning, not form. I encouraged him to practice using the same words he would use in his native language, but in English. I also encouraged him to watch English TV shows and movies, and pay attention to how native speakers communicate. He soon started picking up on the conversational style, with phrases like, I mean, you know, and like, which made him feel more comfortable. Arif began practicing these techniques and noticed a significant improvement. He wasn't as focused on sounding perfect anymore, but more on being natural and fluid. Now, I want to share a tip that I believe is critical for overcoming overthinking. Engage in real conversations. Whether it's talking to a friend, a teacher, or even practicing with a language exchange partner, real conversations are essential for improving fluency. This is exactly what happened with Sarah, a student of mine who was afraid of making mistakes in front of others. Sarah wanted to practice speaking, but she was terrified of speaking English in front of native speakers. She felt embarrassed about her accent and thought people would judge her for not speaking perfectly. However, I encouraged her to join a conversation club with other English learners. That way, she wouldn't feel pressured to speak perfectly because everyone was learning. The first few times were hard for Sarah. She stammered, and some of her words were wrong. But as she practiced, she realized that the people in the group weren't judging her. They were just happy she was speaking and trying to communicate. The more Sarah spoke, the less she overthought. Soon, she was engaging in longer conversations without hesitating. And after a few months, Sarah was confident enough to speak with native English speakers. She started using phrases she had picked up during group discussions, and her English improved significantly. Her breakthrough came when she realized that speaking English wasn't about being perfect. It was about communicating effectively. Let's also talk about the importance of setting small, achievable goals. One of the main reasons people overthink is that they set unrealistic expectations for themselves. They think they need to speak flawlessly within a short amount of time. This kind of pressure causes anxiety and makes it even harder to speak. I've worked with students like Samir, who would set huge goals like, I want to speak like a native speaker in 6 months. These types of goals can lead to frustration and disappointment because fluency doesn't happen overnight. Instead, I encourage students to set smaller, more achievable goals. For example, today, I'll have a 5-minute conversation with a friend in English. Once Samir shifted his focus to smaller, more attainable goals, he stopped overthinking. As he ticked off each small goal, his confidence grew. Eventually, Samir was able to have 30-minute conversations in English without hesitation. One of my students, Jason, came to me one afternoon feeling defeated. Teacher, he said, I always know what I want to say, but I get so nervous, I freeze up before I say anything. My mind starts racing and I start worrying about making mistakes. And I told him, Jason, you're not alone. Overthinking is something that happens to everyone, but you need to break free from it if you want to speak fluently. I shared with him something I learned many years ago. If you keep overthinking every word, you'll never get anything out. The best way to improve your speaking is to just open your mouth and let the words flow. Of course, you might make mistakes. That's part of the process. But overthinking causes hesitation, and hesitation is what stops your fluency from developing. Jason started practicing speaking English every day, without worrying about making mistakes. He took my advice seriously, and after a few weeks, he came back to me with a huge smile. Teacher, I'm not scared to speak anymore. I just speak now, and it feels so much better. Let's talk about another example. Kelly, a colleague of mine, had been working in a multinational company where English was the primary language of communication. She had a strong command of English grammar and vocabulary, but when it came to speaking during meetings, she would become overly cautious and second-guess herself. She always waited for the perfect moment to speak, but by the time she felt confident, the conversation had already moved on. I told Kelly, don't wait for the perfect moment. Just speak up. The moment you overthink, you lose the chance to contribute. Kelly was hesitant at first, but I encouraged her to speak up early in meetings, even if she wasn't 100% sure. She started making small contributions, and over time, her confidence grew. Eventually, Kelly became one of the most active participants in her meetings. She realized that people didn't care about perfection. They cared about her ideas. I also remember a conversation I had with my grandmother, who's in her 80s. She's a wonderful storyteller, but never learned English formally. When she first started trying to speak English with me, she would constantly apologize for her mistakes. I'm so sorry, I didn't say that right, she would say. But I told her, Grandma, you don't need to apologize, just speak. You're doing great. What I learned from her was that language is about communication, not perfection. Grandma didn't overthink her words. She just spoke from the heart. And that's something I've shared with all my students ever since. Don't focus on being perfect. Focus on being understood. I had a German student named Lucas who faced a similar challenge. Lucas had been living in the US for a few years and had a great understanding of English grammar. However, whenever it came to speaking, he would pause mid-sentence, second-guess his vocabulary, and try to think of the perfect way to say something. But because he was always thinking too much, he didn't speak as fluidly as he could have. I suggested to Lucas, why don't you try to speak as you would in your native language? Just let the words come out without worrying too much. Lucas was skeptical at first, but once he started speaking more freely, without overthinking, his fluency began to improve rapidly. His sentence structure wasn't always perfect, but the more he spoke, the easier it became for him to express himself without hesitation. One of my students, Maria, came from a background where speaking English was always associated with doing it perfectly. Maria's parents were both highly educated, and they emphasized the importance of speaking correctly when she was growing up. As a result, Maria always felt the pressure to speak English flawlessly. During one of our sessions, Maria said, I'm always trying to sound perfect, and it just stresses me out. I don't know how to stop myself from overthinking every sentence. I told her, Maria, the goal isn't perfection, it's communication. You don't have to sound like a textbook. The more you speak, the better you'll get. I encouraged her to start speaking without worrying about mistakes. I even set up a language exchange for her with a fellow student, Jake, who was also learning English. They would chat every week, and the focus wasn't on correctness, but on just having a natural conversation. It wasn't long before Maria came to me and said, Teacher, I've been talking to Jake every week, and now it's so much easier to speak. I feel like I'm getting better without even trying to be perfect. One of the most memorable students I've had was Ben, a college student studying abroad. Ben was studying engineering, and his academic English was top-notch. However, when it came to casual conversations, he felt lost. He would freeze up when talking to his American classmates and always seemed to overthink his responses. One day, Ben came to me after class and said, Teacher, I feel like I'm constantly thinking about the grammar and structure of my sentences. It's hard to have a normal conversation when I'm worrying about every detail. I told him, Ben, that's normal at first, but you need to stop thinking about grammar during a conversation. Just speak freely, make mistakes, laugh, and learn. I suggested Ben start watching English YouTube channels and podcasts on topics he was passionate about, like technology. He started practicing speaking about engineering topics in English, explaining concepts he already knew. But this time, he wasn't worried about using perfect grammar. He was focused on explaining the idea clearly. Slowly, he got more comfortable, and his classmates began to appreciate his insights. He also realized that his mistakes weren't a barrier. They were just a part of his learning process. Let's talk about one more example with a different approach. Heather, a student of mine who worked in a customer service role, had the opposite issue. Heather was constantly speaking with customers in English, but she always felt like she wasn't speaking correctly. She was afraid of sounding unprofessional, especially when dealing with difficult customers. I told Heather, don't worry about sounding perfect. Just focus on making the customer feel understood. You can always correct yourself later if needed. To help her get over the fear, I encouraged Heather to role-play different customer service situations with me. We practiced handling difficult customer complaints, and Heather focused on maintaining a calm, helpful attitude, rather than stressing over perfect language. After a few weeks, Heather found that her confidence soared. She began to sound more natural in her customer interactions, and she stopped overthinking every word. The key was to trust herself and just speak. Overthinking is one of the biggest barriers to fluency in any language. A lot of my students, including Sarah, come to me and say, "Teacher, I have this fear of speaking English. I always think I'm going to make a mistake, so I end up not saying anything at all." And that's exactly what we're here to fix today. First, let me tell you a little story. A few months ago, Sarah, a student from New York, came to me with a worried expression. She had been studying English for years, but found that she still struggled to speak confidently. She always thought, what if I make a mistake? What if they don't understand me? I looked at Sarah and said, Sarah, the truth is, mistakes are a part of learning. Don't worry about the mistakes. Focus on the conversation. Every time you speak, you improve. The more you speak, the more natural it will feel. But the first time Sarah tried speaking without overthinking, she felt uncomfortable. That's natural. The key is to start small and practice regularly. I suggested that she start a daily conversation challenge. Every day, Sarah would speak English for just 5 minutes about any topic that interested her, whether it was a movie, a book, or even her favorite food. At first, she stumbled and had to stop to think about the words, but within a few weeks, she was speaking for 15 minutes without hesitation. The trick was consistency. Little by little, her confidence grew, and so did her fluency. Let's take a different approach and talk about Elizabeth, a colleague of mine from Boston. Elizabeth worked in the tech industry and was fluent in reading and writing English, but she always hesitated when it came to speaking. Elizabeth told me, "Teacher, I've noticed that I'm very good at writing emails or reports in English, but when I'm in a meeting, I freeze. I'm worried I might say something wrong." And I completely understood. The trick I shared with Elizabeth was to practice speaking the way she wrote, that is, with structure and clarity, but not worrying too much about being perfect. So instead of practicing complex sentences, I suggested she practice short sentences, clear, concise, and to the point. I encouraged Elizabeth to write a summary of a meeting or conversation she'd had, and then practice speaking that summary out loud. After a week of practicing in this way, she came back to me smiling. "Teacher, I did it. I spoke up in a meeting today without overthinking. I just said what I wanted to say." This was a game changer for Elizabeth. She started focusing on delivering her message clearly, and the fear of making mistakes slowly disappeared. Now, let's move to an African student, Mohammed, who came to me with a very different challenge. Mohammed had a beautiful accent and spoke fluently in his native language, but he felt self-conscious about speaking English because he didn't want his accent to be misunderstood. He'd say, "Teacher, I'm afraid my accent will make me sound unprofessional." How can I speak English well if my accent is so strong? I reassured Mohammed that accents are a natural part of language. I shared with him that even native English speakers have regional accents, and that the most important thing was for him to be understood. I suggested a technique: shadowing. Shadowing involves listening to short audio clips in English, such as a podcast or an interview, and trying to repeat exactly what you hear, not focusing on how perfect the pronunciation is, but on getting the rhythm, stress, and flow of the language right. This would help Muhammad become more confident in his speaking, and the more he practiced, the less self-conscious he became. After a few weeks of shadowing, Muhammad's speaking became more fluid, and he was no longer worried about his accent. The goal is clear communication, not perfect pronunciation. Let's talk about my little niece, Amira, who's only 8 years old. She's bilingual and speaks both English and Bengali fluently. But when she was younger, she was very shy about speaking English in front of others. Whenever we had family gatherings, Amira would cling to her parents and not participate in conversations with the other kids because she was afraid she would say something wrong. One day I told Amira, "Don't worry about making mistakes, sweetie. Everyone makes them. The important thing is to have fun while you're speaking. The more you speak, the easier it will get." I came up with a fun game to help her. We played a game where I would point at random objects around the house, and Amira had to describe them in English. For example, I would point to a cup and say, "What's this?" She would answer, "It's a cup." And then I'd ask her to use it in a sentence, "I'm drinking water from a cup." The key was to keep the game lighthearted and not focus on mistakes. Amira began to speak more confidently, and within a few months, she was using full sentences without any hesitation. Next up, we have David, one of my students from Texas. David had been learning English for a while and was pretty good at reading and writing, but speaking was still a huge obstacle for him. He felt that speaking wasn't a natural part of his routine, and it made him anxious. David would always second-guess himself before speaking, wondering if he was saying the right thing. I asked David to do something out of his comfort zone, to record himself speaking. The trick here is to listen to yourself. I told him to choose a topic he enjoyed, something as simple as his favorite hobby or a recent trip, and speak about it for 2 minutes. Then, listen to the recording. "What do you hear?" I asked. David was surprised to hear that his English wasn't as bad as he thought. He was speaking naturally, without overthinking. After a few weeks of recording and listening, David found that he was more confident when speaking in front of others. He was less concerned about making mistakes and more focused on getting his ideas across. I want to finish by talking about Nina, a student who had just moved to the US from Russia. Nina had a lot of great ideas, but she was afraid to speak because of her accent and her fear of making mistakes. She would often say, "Teacher, I understand everything, but I'm scared to speak because I think I'll sound silly." I told Nina, "Your accent is part of who you are, and it's nothing to be ashamed of. Focus on making your message clear and don't worry about being perfect." We practiced something called role-playing. Role-playing involves pretending you're in a real-life situation, like ordering food at a restaurant or asking for directions. I encouraged Nina to practice these situations with me, without worrying about grammar or pronunciation. At first she was nervous, but after several sessions, she began to laugh at herself and enjoy the process. One day, Nina came to me and said, "Teacher, I spoke to a cashier today and I wasn't afraid. I used everything we practiced in our role play." She had conquered her fear by practicing and not overthinking. So, if you're struggling with overthinking and hesitation when it comes to speaking English, remember the key is practice, not perfection. Start small, use games, record yourself, or even role play. These tips can work wonders, just like they did for Sarah, Muhammad, Elizabeth, David and Nina. Don't overthink. Just speak, and you'll find yourself improving every day. I hope these tips and stories inspire you to stop overthinking and start speaking confidently. Remember, the more you practice, the better you'll become. If you found these insights helpful, don't forget to subscribe to See Fluently for more tips and tricks to boost your English skills. Join our community and let's learn together. See you in the next video.